How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're continuing our series of taking a FromSoft game and beating it using mathematically optimized DPS. Today we are going to a game that many people have asked for, and that is Dark Souls 2. Obviously, if you have played any of the Dark Souls games before, you'll know that Dark Souls 2 is kind of the odd one out. One of the biggest things is the fact that the game is actually in a different game engine. So, the program that I have been using to get animation lengths for Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3 does not work for Dark Souls 2. What that means is that for all of the animation lengths, in order to get our per second part of the damage per second calculation formula, I had to go through and take a look at every single weapon in the entire game, record the movesets, and actually count the frames for each of the weapons. It's obviously a lot of work, and I don't have a complete list as I mostly just focused on the two-handed attacks, both the R1-R1 combo and the R2-R2 combo. But no, that is why this video took quite a bit longer to make than either the Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 3 versions of this same concept, that in addition to Dark Souls 2 being quite a bit of a longer game. With that out of the way, let's jump into some of the math behind the game in terms of how we're going to go about figuring out the optimized DPS. First and foremost is the damage calculation formula is significantly different than either of the games that I've done so far. I'll show it on screen here, but essentially what you do is you multiply your attack rating by 6 and by a hand modifier, which is usually 1 if you're using the weapon in the right hand, and 0.9 if you're using your weapon in the left hand. There are a couple of exceptions, but we don't really need to worry about that for this playthrough. You subtract the enemy defense. You divide that value by 6 times the hand modifier again, and then once you get that calculated, you multiply it by the enemy's absorption. You multiply that by the motion value of the weapon, and any damage multipliers such as the red tearstone ring, counter damage, bright bug, so on and so forth. Now, one of the things I just said is that I only did animations for the two-handed attacks, and we did not do any power stance attacks for this run. And the reason being is that whenever you power stance a weapon, or rather a group of weapons, the values of some of these items change. Not necessarily the attack rating, but the motion value is usually quite a bit lower. For example, a lot of the two-handed R2 attacks have motion values of 140 to 150. On your power stance attack, either of your weapons usually cap out at around 110, with a lot of them less than 100. And then the hand modifier does apply to the weapon in your left hand. And for weapon buffs, you can only actually use a spell buff on the weapon in your right hand. You can use a resin for your left hand, but in general, with the length of the animation for the power stance attack and the amount of reduction that you see in some of these numbers, the power stance attacks generally work out to having a lower DPS than a single R2 combination or R1 combination, depending on the weapon that you use for that point in the game. Continuing on with some parts of the damage calculation formula, let's talk about the weapon buffs in the game. These work quite a bit different than Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, where you would get a flat increase or a flat augmentation to your weapon depending on the type of weapon buff you were using. In Dark Souls 2, most weapon buffs add a flat elemental damage that is based on the weapon upgrade level, and then they all apply a certain damage multiplier to that portion of the elemental damage. For example, the Crystal Magic Weapon Sorcery and Sunlight Blade Miracle both modify the following values. They essentially add plus 15 to your flat elemental base AR, which that's not entirely simple. You can't just go ahead and increase the weapon damage by 15. But I'm just listing the actual variable that is increased by these buffs, and then they add a multiplier of 30% to your damage as well. There are a few other different buffs, like Resonant Weapon, which actually doesn't increase your flat AR, but it multiplies your dark damage by 1.35. And this is where damage buffs get a little bit more confusing, because you can still use Resonant Weapon on a weapon that does not have innate dark damage. And despite the fact that you don't increase the flat AR of the dark damage with Resonant Weapon, you still do quite a bit of dark damage whenever you use that hex. Another one that we're going to use, I'm just showing Great Magic Weapon because that is one that we make heavy use of in the early game. It's interesting, it actually adds a higher amount of flat AR to your weapon as opposed to Crystal Magic Weapon, but the damage multiplier is 1.2 instead of the 1.3. And then there are a couple of unique buffs. I'm just showing the two probably most well-known and most common ones, that being the Defender Greatsword, which adds 70 AR and gives you a 1.5 damage multiplier, and the Watcher Greatsword, which gives you plus 10 AR but has a 1.7 damage multiplier, which is the highest in the game. There's like the Possessed Armor Sword, I think adds plus 50 fire AR. And then there's a couple other ones like the Bewitched Elan Sword that add some different calculations, but those weapons will not see use in this run. Perhaps the most important part of building an optimized DPS route through this game are weapon infusions. Whereas we avoided these like the plague in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, primarily because you cannot buff an infused weapon in those games. In Dark Souls 2, you can, and infusions typically make your weapon quite a bit stronger. What they do is they typically split your physical and elemental damage equally. At least the base damage, the scaling AR that you get is obviously going to be a little bit different depending on your stats. But when you do your damage calculation, most weapons also include a hidden 1.4 times damage multiplier when they are infused elementally. There are a couple of cases where the damage multiplier is lower than 1.4, but most weapons in the game have some type of increase in damage, but there are a couple that have 1, and then there are a few weapons that have a damage multiplier less than 1, such as the Moonlight Greatsword, which actually has a 0.8 times damage multiplier whenever you are to infuse it, which I think is the second lowest in the game. I believe the lowest in the game is the Sorcerer's Twin Blade, which has a 0.7x damage multiplier. Generally what this means is that your infused weapons are going to do quite a bit more damage. Again, this scales with your weapon level. So I have a couple of examples against the Last Giant as a test enemy with 15 strength, dexterity, and faith, and the Sunlight Blade Miracle. As a baseline, you do 185 damage per hit. I believe this is on the two-handed R1 attack. If you use Sunlight Blade, you see the physical damage remains the same as expected, but you do 45 lightning damage, so you get a solid increase. When you infuse it, you'll see that the physical damage drops quite a bit, but the lightning damage is 97, so even infusing it outright gives you quite a bit more damage. And in addition to that damage multiplier, another big reason for this is that most enemies in the game, particularly the ones not in the DLC, have super low elemental defenses. A lot of enemies, such as like the Dragon Rider, has I think around 400 physical defense, but his elemental defenses are all less than 50. Continuing on with our example, you can see that if we infuse it with no buff, we get the... Oh, I already covered that one, didn't I? If we infuse it and use Sunlight Blade, our lightning damage jumps up by around 70 points, and then I decided to show what we would get if we go ahead and use an uninfused weapon with Sunlight Blade. You'll see that in comparison to the +0, our lightning damage doesn't quite double, but it jumps from 45 to 81. Obviously, our physical damage is quite a bit higher. Again, that's mostly due to the weapon level. But if we infuse it and use Sunlight Blade, you'll see that the lightning damage jumps all the way up from 81 to 301. So in general, you're going to see that for almost every single fight in the game, we're going to use some type of infusion. with a couple of exceptions being before we can't get to Blacksmith McDuff, and then there are actually a few different enemies in the game where we're going to use just the baseline weapon, which we'll cover coming up. And finally, before we begin, I just figured I'd give a quick histogram of how the DPS of weapons stack up, i.e. in terms of what we are going to be looking at. You can see on this chart, this is against the last giant again at soft cap stats, with the, I think, 130-ish weapons that I have documented. I don't have them all. I excluded some, like the broken straight sword, because obviously those are not going to ever cap out. You can see that there are a small group of weapons. I believe that is 12 or 13 of them that kind of exist in that upper echelon. This is generally going to be the case for most enemies in the game, but you can see Dark Souls 2 does a pretty good job of having a lot of the weapons kind of in the middle, within the one standard deviation. I mean, if you look at it, this is really a bell curve. So, there's obviously some weapons that are going to be clear weapons that are going to be outstanding in comparison to some of the weapons that we're going to be able to use in the game. But if your only takeaway is that a lot of the weapons in the game are generally going to be viable, maybe that's something that you can take away from this histogram. Anyways, it is on to the run. So one of the first things on our journey that I have been doing in the background is figuring out what we are going to start with. And the first thing that I decided to do was go ahead, enter the Covenant of Champions, and farm the Ogre in the Forest of the Fallen Giants. Now, being in the Covenant is necessary because it will allow the Ogre to respawn indefinitely, and we can also grind awe stones from this guy, which once you get 10 of them, you can actually turn those in for Great Magic Weapon. This isn't strictly necessary because you can get Great Magic Weapon in the Black Gulch, but it is a lot easier to do, at least at the outset. But not only that, this is probably the easiest way to farm just regular Titanite shards early game, although you can buy a number of those from the blacksmith in the Majula hub area. With some of the souls that we are farming from the ogres as well, we can make use of those and buy the Silver Cat ring to reduce damage from falling, which is going to be very important in just a short moment. We can get the Lenin Grass Key, a fragrant branch of yore, and 3 bright bugs from Malentia in the Forest of the Fallen Giants. And we can also pick up an early Titanite slab in the hidden chamber as we come out of it. While we're here in the Forest of the Fallen Giants, we can also start Pate's questline, pick up the Sorcerer's Staff, and then make a quick detour over to the Grave of Saints to pick up Whisper of Despair. This is a hex that reduces the physical defense of the opponent that you hit by 200 points. With our Silver Cat ring, we can head down into the Black Gulch and we can start farming for both Titanite chunks and large Titanite shards from these worm monsters, I guess is what you call them. And then before we get going to face our boss, once we have gathered up the requisite amount, we can free Rosabeth to pick up the red Tearstone ring. And with the Titanite slab in hand and all of the other Titanite farming that we have done, we can get a plus 10 weapon. We're going to use the halberd before we face the first boss of the run. The first boss that we're going to fight is the last giant, and similar to my previous runs, I'm going to be showing my stats, the weapon that we're using, the weapon buff, and then any other augmentations. For this one, it is going to be the plus 10 halberd with a great magic weapon, red Tearstone ring, and Whisper of Despair. You see our DPS around 534.1. And just a note here, I can't always actually get the attack in for the halberd class. It's usually the R2, which does 2 hits on the spin. Sometimes there's not enough openings, so I may occasionally use an R1 attack or a different type of attack when I'm in these fights. But the general conceit is that I'm using the weapon that has the highest theoretical DPS output. The next boss on our list is going to be the Pursuer, but before that we have to go ahead and pick up our next weapon. thanks to all of the upgrading that we have been doing, we can pick up the blacksmith hammer from Leningrad in Majula, and we can go ahead and grab ourselves a titanite slab from trading our petrified something in things betwixt. The reason we're doing the Pursuer is because he is a gatekeeper on our run. I haven't really talked about that, but there are a variety of different enemies that gate off certain upgrades that we can get. Mostly rings, but there are a couple that do gate weapons. For the Pursuer, of course, that is the Ring of Blades, which gives you a flat increase to your physical AR. And we are generally using the same setup, except for this time we're using the blacksmith hammer. With the Pursuer dead, we can take the Crow over to the Lost Bastille, pick up the Dull Ember, which is only available in this location in Scholar of the First Sin, drop it off to Blacksmith McDuff, and make a quick pit stop to free Weaponsmith Ornifex. Now, despite the fact that we have elemental infusions unlocked with the Dull Ember, we're actually not going to make use of those for Scorpioness Nashandra, as she has quite a good magic defense, and the only elemental damage buff that we have available to us at this point is Great Magic Weapon. Now, somewhat interestingly enough, the gold pine resin actually adds a higher flat base damage to your weapons than every other buff in the game outside of the Defender Greatsword, and I believe the Possessed Armor Sword, but the drawback is that you cannot use a resin on an infused weapon like you can a sorcery, hex, or miracle buff, which in combination with the hidden damage multiplier that you get on the infused weapons makes them generally a worse option when you're going for optimized DPS. With Nashandra down, we can go ahead and pick up a great weapon in the Mastodon Halberd, infuse it with magic, and go ahead and face our first Lord Soul Holder of the game in the Rotten. Now, I haven't used Bright Bugs before this fight, and I totally forgot to do it in this fight. My intent was to use them on the Big Four as well as any of the kind of endgame bosses. But you can see that this fight was not really difficult, even despite the fact that I did not use a Bright Bug against the Rotten in this case. The Rotten was another one of those gatekeepers that we just talked about, as killing him allows us to access the first DLC once we pick up both the Forgotten Key and the Dragon Talon, and we can head into Shulva, the Sanctum City. Here we can pick up two very crucial rings for this run. The Flynn's Ring, which adds up to 50 physical AR if your equipment load is 60 or less, as well as the first of the clutch rings in this run, the Lightning Clutch Ring. As we face off against the Dragon Rider, it's a good time to point out that despite the Flynn's Ring and Ring of Blades adding flat physical AR, if you infuse them, the actual amount of added physical AR does kind of scale evenly with the reduction in physical AR that you get when you split a damage with an elemental infusion. So if your physical damage goes from, say, 100% at the normal infusion down to 60% with an elemental infusion, the plus 50 from the Flynn's Ring is also multiplied by that same 60%. We also pick up the Rotunda Lockstone, which allows us to go ahead and grab Resonant Weapon, which sees heavy use in this run. And with Resonant Weapon in hand, we go ahead and face off against the Prowling Magus and Congregation. And I just want to point out that this, as well as some of the other gank bosses, are the fights that I don't actually use Whisper of Despair in, because it is basically impossible to hit all the enemies, given that we only have 2 casts. With those guys down, we can take on another of our Lord Soul Holders in the Duke's Dear Freya, and I think this fight killed me the second most out of any boss in the entire run. I did the run back so many times that the enemies stopped respawning. In fact, this is a fight that's difficult to do at the low levels of health for Red Tearstone Ring because of all the spiders that are in the boss arena. And yeah, it was very annoying, and I think I did more than half the fight with both the Whisper of Despair and my weapon buff inactive just because of how long it took. With Freya down, we have to go back to Majula to pick up the Ring of Whispers so that we can talk to Man-Scorpion Tark and get the Black Scorpion Stinger, which we will go ahead and infuse with the Raw Infusion, which is very effective on this weapon because it has no scaling by default. And then we can go ahead and face off against the Skeleton Lords. Now, getting the Black Scorpion Stinger wasn't strictly necessary, but if I'm going to be honest, I did that because I totally forgot that the Skeleton Lords were a boss in this game, and obviously we're not going to use a thrusting weapon. Instead, we had to go ahead and pick up the Gurm Great Hammer, which I acquired when I was doing my farming for the Mastodon Halberd. This is another one of the fights where we do not use the Whisper of Despair Miracle, obviously because there are 3 Skeleton Lords and then they all split into multiple skeletons whenever they die. And this is one of the very few fights where we actually don't use an infusion on our weapon, and that is because the physical defense of the Skeleton Lords when it comes to strike defense is so low that we don't want to reduce our physical damage by any portion at all in this fight. But with the Skeleton Lords dead, we can go into Earthen Peak and face off against everybody's favorite boss in the Covetous Demon, and we can show off the Black Scorpion Stinger. And fun fact, this is the first fight in this playthrough where our DPS climbs over 1,000 at 1,001.3. With the Covetous Demon down, we don't go ahead and fight Mytha. Instead, we can go ahead and find Pate in Earthen Peak and get the Engraved gauntlets. We're going to be wearing these from here on out in our run. These have a percentage chance to give you a 1.5 times damage multiplier on a hit. I believe it's 1 in every 20 hits, so it's actually pretty good with fast weapons, but I'm not going to factor it directly into the formula, but just know that I do have these on for the rest of the run. With our shiny new gauntlets around our wrists, we can go ahead and face off against Mytha the Baneful Queen. Funnily enough, it is actually the same exact setup as we were using versus the Covetous Demon, the raw Black Scorpion Stinger, and all the same buffs. And Mytha is quick work, although I think she took a little bit longer than the Covetous Demon, which I think the Covetous Demon was maybe the fastest fight in this entire run. Not sure, I didn't time them all. In my initial routing, I thought that I had to go ahead and face off the Rune Sentinels now so I could go ahead and talk to Strayed. I didn't actually have to do that in hindsight, but you'll see that the DPS here, again using the Gurm Great Hammer, another one of the times where we're not using an elemental infusion because of the super high strike weakness that the Rune Sentinels had. It doesn't really make too much of a difference because a combo for the R1 with the hammer that we're using is able to 2-shot each of the Rune Sentinels, even despite the fact that we are not using Whisper of Despair in this fight. Before facing off against the Lost Sinner, however, the Smelter Demon is another one of the gatekeepers, as we can acquire the Ring of Blades +1 from his boss room once he goes down. Got quite a low dark defense rating, so the Dark Mastodon Halberd and Resonant Weapon makes very quick work of one of the toughest bosses in the game for the stage in the game that it's at. With the Smelter Demon down, we can pick up the Ring of Blades +1 and keep trudging on through Iron Keep to face off against the Old Iron King. Another one of the instances where we go ahead and make use of all the available buffs that we can use, but we're still sticking with the Mastodon Halberd as we have been for a majority of the last couple of fights. And if nothing else, this should tell you that the Mastodon Halberd is perhaps the strongest weapon in the game. I haven't really mentioned it because I kind of wanted to play a little coy, but for the most part, this weapon constantly was in the top 20, if not top 10 or top 5, against pretty much every boss in the game with a couple of exceptions. With the Old Iron King down, we can go ahead and get the Heavy Iron Key from the Forest of the Fallen Giants in cool fashion by doing the Lizard Jump, and then we can go into the second DLC to pick up the Sorcery Clutch Ring. With all of our rings and buffs in hand, let's go ahead and take on the last of the 4 Lord Soul holders in the Lost Sinner. And this is the only fight in the game where our infusion type actually is different than our buff type. That's right, we're using the magic infusion on our Mastodon Halberd alongside Resonant Weapon. Now, if we had the Dark Clutch Ring at this point, we would instead use the Dark Mastodon Halberd, but that is not available to us yet unless we wanted to grind 2 million souls, which is something I didn't really feel like doing for this run, as I don't really think it fits the spirit. But yeah, just an interesting point of clarification here that we're using a different infusion type than we are weapon buff type. With all of the Lord Souls in hand, we can finally make our way to Drangleic Castle. In there, we can pick up the Frozen Flower, head back to the Shrine of Winter, and then trudge through the Ivory King DLC to pick up the Dark Clutch Ring for our upcoming fights. We can make use of it right away against the Twin Dragon Rider fight. This one can be a little bit annoying because the archery guy on top tends to be super aggressive whenever he hops down. So we just got to make sure that we can kill the halberd wielding one quickly before the second one joins the fight. And we can take him down and move on to the Looking Glass Knight. It's basically the exact same setup for him. And despite being in the rain, which does lower his lightning defense quite a bit, the Dark Mastodon Halberd and Resonant Weapon is still our optimized DPS weapon of choice. I like the Looking Glass Knight. I think it's one of the better fights in the game. I haven't really said too much about the game, but I like Dark Souls 2, although you'll see at the end of it, the number of deaths that I incurred in this run was so much higher than both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3 combined, even though I didn't show those. But this fight definitely could have been a lot cleaner if I didn't hit his shield more the times than I would have liked to admit. He's also really easy to get in some good hits if he ever does his summoning animation, although that didn't really end up being a factor in my fight against him this time. With Looking Glass Knight down, we can make our way into everybody's favorite level in the game, in the Shrine of Amana. Here, we can pick up Sunlight Blade, and it's on to the Demon of Song. But again, ironically enough, it is still the Dark Mastodon Halberd with Resonant Weapon in this fight as well. But fret not, we're going to go away from that here as we finally make our way back to Things Betwixt and do our first reallocation of stats in this playthrough. And we do so because our next boss, which will be Velstadt, has very low lightning defense. And Velstadt was another one of the tougher boss fights in my playthrough here, as he's got some more than questionable hitboxes, especially when he does his backstep and attack animation. That Sacred Chime Hammer really likes to hit you when it's going by you, even though it's not really in a swing motion. Either way, this also highlights that Velstadt has some incredibly juiced defenses whenever he enters Phase 2. He's one of the very few boss fights in this game that has a distinct Phase 2, and you can see that towards the end of the fight, our damage per hit really drops, although it was a pretty easy fight once I got good enough RNG. With Velstadt down, of course, we can go back to Strayed and pick up the Sacred Oath Miracle, which is not quite as good as it was in Dark Souls 3. Here in Dark Souls 2, it only adds a flat physical damage AR, kind of the same way that it does with the Ring of Blades or Flames Ring, where it scales proportionally to the amount of physical damage that you lose whenever you're using an infused weapon, or it gives you plus 50 if you're using a baseline weapon. Because Sacred Oath also takes up 4 attunement slots, we had to reallocate some attributes as well before we can go ahead and face off against the Guardian Dragon, who is pretty easy if he stays on the ground for a long time, but if he does a lot of his flying attacks, it is pretty annoying. Either way, another quick fight, and we are really close to the end game. It's going to be pretty much boss rush from here on out, with a couple of upgrades still yet to come. Next fight I am showing is actually the Throne Watcher and Defender, because apparently, when I am editing this, I must have deleted the footage I had against the Giant Lord. I will throw up the DPS calculation on screen. It is again the Dark Mastodon Halberd and Resonant Weapon combination, but I have no idea where that went. Either way, for the Throne Watcher and Defender, their defenses are actually basically the exact same. At least in terms of elemental. I'd have to go back and check their physical. But this is the one fight that we're actually going to summon, because I find this fight when it's 1-on-2 to be incredibly difficult. So I figured I'll just give myself a little bit of leeway by summoning Benhart so that we can take away some of the aggression. After the Watcher and Defender go down, we can face off against the last boss of the main game in Nashandra, as I didn't actually fulfill the qualification to face off against Aldia in this playthrough. But I did go ahead and reallocate some stats because I wanted to juice up my DPS as high as you could possibly go against Nashandra, as I figured it only made sense being the last boss of the game. And in fact, this is the highest total DPS that we achieve in this playthrough at 1271.9. Before we go ahead and take on the DLCs, we can go ahead and pick up the final ring upgrade by burning an ascetic in the King's Gate bonfire with the Throne Watcher, Defender, and Nashandra down, and we can pick up the Ring of Blades +2 from the throne room. For the DLC bosses, starting with Alana, I did go ahead and grind up some levels so that these fights would be a little bit more enjoyable. I went ahead and kind of soft capped myself at some of the damage stats, and also got a little bit more endurance and adaptability, so I have larger dodging windows. For Alana, this was actually a pretty easy fight. I had to get good RNG with the summon and teleports, but once I really was able to get in there and get some consistent hits, I was actually able to kill her before she finished summoning her skeletons. Before fighting our next boss, we went ahead and grabbed the Drake Wing Ultra Greatsword from Weaponsmith Ornifex, and we're going to be facing off against the Fume Knight. And this is because I don't really find the Sin fight or the Gank Squad fight to be very enjoyable, and seeing as this video has already taken me quite a bit of time to make, I decided that for the DLC fights, I am just going to fight the bosses that I find enjoyable, as opposed to fighting all of them in all 3 DLCs. I like the Fume Knight fight especially because we finished it with a pretty cool flourish, as he was just about to hit me before I got the final shot in. And the reason that we're actually using the Drake Wing Ultra Greatsword is a lot of the DLC bosses have really high elemental defenses in comparison to the base game. So weapons like this one, that have a lot of physical damage even when infused, generally seem to be the best choice. And as I say that, we go right back to the Mastodon Halberd, this time with the Magic Infusion to face off against Sir Alan, which is a lot of people's choice for best boss or second best boss in the entire game, depending on how you feel about the Burnt Ivory King. Fun fact, this is actually the first time in my playthroughs of Dark Souls 2 that I was able to get the seppuku animation because I killed Sir Alan hitless. So there's that. And no, I am not going to be fighting the other Smelter Demon in the DLC because that run back is absolutely miserable. So it's on to the Ivory King DLC, where we have to face off against Ava, which again, I don't really like this fight. Unfortunately, it is mandatory if you want to face off against the Burnt Ivory King. Just because she tends to jump around a lot and you can't really get a good sense of just how high your DPS is, as opposed to some of the fights that we have had in the back half of this video. Either way, with her down, before we face off against the Burnt Ivory King, I figured let's go ahead, take down the Ancient Dragon, which took quite a bit and is a very big slog as well, because there's not really a great way, again, to kind of actually get your true maximum DPS, because in order to fight him, you really just kind of got to stick around against his toes, which I think have increased damage absorptions for physical damage, so that one is just a slog. For our last two fights of the run, it's time for some regicides, starting off with Vendrick, who, again, we are sticking with that lightning mastodon halberd, and this was a pretty easy fight. I only died to him a couple of times, actually. I don't find this to be a particularly difficult fight, especially at the stage in the game where you need to fight him, because you kind of got to have all 5 giant souls. So, yeah. After that, it is on to what most people consider, myself included, to be the best boss in Dark Souls 2. And for the Burnt Ivory King, I did go ahead and make an effort, picked up another soul vessel so that I could really reallocate my stats in an appropriate fashion to get 99 faith and super high strength so that I could truly maximize my DPS against this boss up close to 1200. And once we actually start getting some hits in, you can see just how quickly his health bar melts. He was actually unable to ever do his weapon buff animation. And that's it. That is every boss in this playthrough specifically that I am going to go ahead and fight. So after my journey, would I recommend you trying out this run exactly how I have done it? I gotta say the answer is no. I died 233 times in this run. As I show here, I played offline for the entirety and died so many times, which that in combination with having to get the animation lengths for every weapon in the game contributed to why this video took so long to make. But despite that, it was still fun to do, and if you enjoyed it, please feel free to leave a like, a comment, or a subscription. I'll be sure to tackle this in other FromSoft games coming up. Until then, we will see you all in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.